this off. I'm going to put everyone on mute. Margot, I'm going to unmute you, and you're ready to go.
All right. Oops, I almost left the meeting instead of went to share screen. Okay, here we go. The planning committee was made up of agricultural, business, tribal governments, federal government, state government, including state lands that owns most of the Owens Lake, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, local governments, the Inyo County, environmental NGOs that I mentioned before, including also the Native Plant Society, open space NGOs, energy interests, including LADWP, as well as community and education groups. So it was very broad. And everyone came together. And so you had the Owens Lake master planning process beginning. Dust control, which was mandated by the state implementation plan. You had habitat, that was the interest of some of the NGOs. You had other public trust resources that are the interest of the state lands. Along with habitat, you have aesthetics, public access, and cultural resources. DWP was interested not only in controlling the dust, but also they didn't want to use that much water. So their interest is in a reduction of water. And the Great Basin Air Pollution Control Program simply wants to control the dust. If they could, they would flood that whole lake. But this is the group, and these are the processes and the interests that came together. The grazers were mostly on the edges and not so much in the project area, as well as the Rio Tinto mine, also not exactly in the dust control area, but an interested party and attending with good input from them as well. So when I think about Ballona, I think, what happened? You know, there was a public process, but I think it was much more of a top-down process, and the public just listened. I could be wrong, but we can talk about that in the questions. Because you all were there more than I was, because I was in Owens Lake. So here's how Owens Lake did it. There was a facilitator, an important factor, a non-interested, non-biased facilitator. So working together, the facilitator and participants will work together to create a problem-solving environment and to implement these agreements to that aim. And this is what the group agreed to in terms of how we would conduct ourselves in the meetings. You know, listen and openly discuss the issues with others holding diverse views. View disagreements as problems to be solved rather than battles to be won. Refrain from ascribing motives or intentions to other participants. I think, you know, these first three are just like, okay, that's what we need to do. Respect the integrity and values of other participants. And then we get into the nuts and bolts of honor time. Don't waste people's time. Don't talk forever. Use conversational courtesy. Appreciate humor, but don't engage in humor at the expense of others. And keep your cell phone silent. This was the working nuts and bolts. There's other aspects to this planning process. There was a charter, there were agreements on if you don't agree, if there's not 100% consensus, what do we do then? And it goes through a whole process. Work groups were part of that process. So the entire almost 40 member stakeholder group couldn't know everything about all the aspects of Owens Lake. So work groups were formed as necessary during the process of the master planning. So there was a habitat work group, and they were responsible for developing methods to support and preserve habitat. And at first, they were thinking of a preserve, like designate an area as a preserve. But what we finally, after several years, came up with a habitat suitability model across the whole lake. So it's a whole landscape scale model that guides management of each of the dust control areas. And then others provide advice on implementation, enhance strategies, and develop an adaptive management strategy. The dust control work group had to work, mostly this was Great Basin and state lands and the air sciences and LADWP working on new and modified best available control methods. So this was timing and amount of each new or modified BACM, how you test the BACMs, timing of testing, etc., and how testing is perceived in terms of designated areas. Because remember, while we're in this planning group and as we're implementing dust control, the Great Basin Air Quality Pollution Control Board is designating new areas every few years. So it's not a static, well, we'll wait for 15 years and then we'll start. No, we're working, we're moving and doing. There was also a public access and recreation group, and that was charged with developing how and where to incorporate public access. And all of these included cultural resources, because you can't really move out there. You have to have monitoring, and you have to work with the tribes on where the sensitive areas are, but especially in public access. So here's birders out on a big day, counting birds and everyone working together. Here's designated dust control units. We had, much as the larger planning committee, we had selected a person to run our meetings. And this person was with the Eastern Sierra Audubon, a retired lawyer. He is very good at running meetings, at summing up, at keeping everything on an even keel. So our small work group was run similarly to the larger planning committee. I was part of it in that I was a scientist. I was still working for DWP, but we all trusted each other in these groups. And at first it's odd. You think, well, who's the public? You kind of have a chip on your shoulder because you've been working out there just with your team, and you think, now I have to add this. It's already hard enough working on Owens Lake. But it really was so instructive and such a good process. and you had to be prepared. You had to be prepared for the planning committee meetings. You had to read everything they sent, and you also had to be prepared for our habitat work group meetings. So this is an example of once we decided not to designate one area, and one of the reasons we decided not to designate just one area as a preserve is that when dust control first started in 2000 in the mitigation, they had said this will be 2,000 acres will be designated for birds. And okay, that was designated for birds and would be managed for birds, but guess what? The birds didn't like it. So then what? So we took the whole lake and applied a habitat suitability model. And what that is you get parameters. In this case, I'm showing you the Owens Lake Meadow Guild. So guild members are, Tule elk, Owens Valley vole, other rodents and various reptiles, northern harrier, Savannah sparrow, burrowing owl, and other ground nesting birds, as well as rare plants in wet to drier meadows. So you get a full range of species here and wildlife that you have to consider. So the parameters are vegetation cover, species diversity of the vegetation, the structure, did it have some tall, some short, and then the vegetated topographic diversity. And this, you evaluate each of these parameters based on a 0 to 1, and you give it a score. And so each of these dust control areas were given a score. The darker green is a higher score than the lighter green. So some have no score whatsoever because they're beyond for plants. Plants don't want to be in there at all. So this is what a lake-wide, and we also measured right up to the planning area was to the old lake edge at 3,600 elevation. And so it includes the existing seeps and springs along the edge of the lake. So not only the dust control areas, but the existing, so that they could be monitored and preserved. So the planning committee continued on until 2013. And at that time, they agreed on project objectives and planning framework. But there was a sticking point, and it's still being worked out at this point. And so it became the master project. And so we wrote up, and I was one of the people that for some reason had to write up the collaboration report with my writing partner, Andrea Schmid. So we took what was all agreed upon and put it into this report on Owens Lake. And in 2015, there was a sequence notice for preparation of the master project based mostly on the frameworks developed here. I'm just showing you this as a background. So here we are in 2010, starting on the master planning, and the habitat work group is in the sort of magenta color here. We started in 2014 to work at the request of another work group, the groundwater work group. They wanted to know how much water could a seep or spring get away with not having if DWP was going to pump groundwater. And so we had to develop this we didn't know the answer, so we had to take several years to figure out how we would even approach that question. And we came up with some great tools and a great resource protection plan that now they've taken into the groundwater work group. So that's how things can work together. Different work groups can utilize technology, have speakers come in from the other work groups. So I'm just showing you the amount of time these things take. A long time. We, in the Habitat Work Group, developed an adaptive management for our habitat suitability model. So we identified the management priorities for each of the 6 guilds of birds and animals. We then developed the management strategies and actions, as you saw in the habitat suitability model. We implement and monitor. So each criteria or parameter that is described for each guild is some parameter that can be measured either monthly or quarterly, seasonally, annually. It can be measured. This is the point. It can be measured, and it can be measured without, and really without great, I mean, there's effort in it, but it's not an irresponsible amount of measurement. So that was where you could say, well, this is a proxy. We can't measure brine flies, for instance, that are very important to shorebirds. That's very time consuming and difficult to do, but we can measure salinity all the time. And that tells us if we have good brine fly habitat or not. So those are the types of proxies we can use for different aspects and make it measurable and make it doable. And then the reports can come annually and can be adjusted depending on the effectiveness monitoring. So the validation of the model and the annual effectiveness monitoring is coming from, counting, for instance, birds, which is done frequently. And here we have some stilts, black-necked stilts. So what came out of the Habitat Work Group and the planning committee was the planning framework. So we ended up with 5 focal species of guilds. Breeding waterfowl, that's mallards and ducks, gadwalls. Migrating waterfowl, that's northern shovelers. Western snowy plover has its own guild. Now it's a shorebird and it breeds there, and so do the avocets. But we created the first, we call it 1.0 habitat suitability model. And we had outside scientists review it. Then we made adjustments. We had, based on their recommendations, we had habitat suitability model 2.0. And a few years later, we sent it off to Point Blue, formerly Point Reyes Bird Observatory. And Point Blue went through the model with a fine-tooth comb. And so we made the adjustments, worked with them back and forth, the whole habitat working group, and came up with 3.0. Now we're getting ready, I think, for 3.1 perhaps. And that would be based more on bird counts and small adjustments. Because remember, none of these focal guilds have been weighted. They're all equally important at this point. But there could be a case made for snowy plovers being weighted because of their designation by the state. So that's sort of where we are. We're years into the monitoring and adaptive management and the adjustments. And here's the latest adjustment of 3.0, making the snowy plover habitat suitability model just its own guild, and avocets went into the migrating. So, you know, this is not just based on our own, but independent scientific review and Point Blue being quite respected. The planning framework continues for water conservation and you know, trying to get modified or transition water intensive dust control measures to use less water. So they have something called TWB2, which is a tillage where you till the soil in great blocks. So it can only be in the clay soils. You till it and you leave it rough like that. And then it doesn't blow and it doesn't form the salt crust. But because Great Basin Air Pollution District wants some backup, there is tillage with backup. So that's shallow flood. So if it starts to blow, you can immediately shallow flood the tillage area. I told you nothing was easy out here. And all of these changes would then have to be evaluated within the habitat suitability model, because we've committed to maintaining the value across the lake for each of the guilds. And that means we have to make something better somewhere else if we're going to take water away. So that's the balance. Right now we have 3 technical work groups going, the habitat work group, the groundwater work group, which we are supplying information to, and then I think public access and recreation is still operating. Although here is the public access points for the 110 square miles. I just put this up here because even at Owens Lake, as big as it is, nobody wants the public running amok amongst the birds' habitat or the meadow voles' habitat. So here it is, the main highway through all the dust control, and you can enter on Sulphate Road, you can enter at Dirty Sock Springs or at Willow Dip, Lake Minerals Road, and you can drive through and out, and here's Brady Highway up at the north end of the lake. And there are some areas here, about this area, where you can get a good view. There's a good overlook, nice public trail through there. So why did I tell you all this? Well, because it occurred to me that Ballona, is there the will for a collaborative approach among CDFW, state lands, LA County, all the nonprofits, and the private businesses? Is there that will? I don't know.
So are there any questions?
Cindy seems to have one.
Okay, so Cindy, go ahead.
Are there people who are professional facilitators? Oh, yes. We had a group out of Sacramento State University. There's a different facilitator after all these years, but yes, there are people. At the beginning of the process, they interviewed several different people before they decided who. And I believe that was, probably California Audubon with LADWP executive committee. There was an executive committee.
So, Walter?
So I agree that a facilitator is perhaps the biggest or most important element of these discussions, because it is my experience that there is so much animosity, just personal animosity built up, that it is really hard to ask even just a scientific question without somebody feeling as though they're being attacked. And if we oftentimes divide up into groups and have conversations, this group, that group, and we're not speaking together at the same time so that we can address one group's perceptions, with scientific information. And I'll make just one quick example. Jonathan, who I'm not sure is on the call, found, least Bell's vireos, and he and I text back all the time now about the least Bell's vireos, which were confirmed to be nesting in the Ballona Wetlands. And this is something that should just be a scientific observation, and somehow it's been politicized, where some folks want to downplay the presence of the vireos, and other people want to sort of play it up, and rather than just incorporating the scientific information, having an objective conversation about it. So I think a facilitator who truly was impartial, and that's key because we've had some facilitators who have not been impartial, but they can kind of pull everyone back from the brink and refocus. And I think the key thing on your slide, Margot, which I did see from a Ballona Wetlands work group slide from 2008, is this idea of treating disagreements as challenges to be addressed or problems to be solved rather than battles to be won.
Yes.
And it was interesting to me to see that in a Ballona work group presentation back in 2008, when there used to be actually quite a few groups, and they've all been, I think the last of them met in 2012. And I guess, sorry to take such a long time to wrap this into a question for you, Margot, but what are your thoughts on all these groups having ended in 2012, when they completed the feasibility study? Do you think that those groups could come back and have a role now, given kind of that we're stuck? It seems like we're stuck in part of the planning process.
Well, I think it's kind of the only way if we're going to avoid this acrimony continuing, is to bring it back. Let's listen. Owens was pretty acrimonious before we got started on this planning master plan. I mean, no one trusted LADWP. I can just tell you. And, as a scientist working on the project, you kind of think, oh my goodness, I'm going to have to answer, questions. But everyone's interested and everyone's honestly interested. And so there were no, once the ground rules were laid out, there was very little disingenuous behavior. People just said what they needed to say. So I think, given that Owens was acrimonious before, so acrimonious that, you know, the Nature Conservancy, California Audubon, Eastern Sierra Audubon, and the Plant Society, Native Plant Society, were all working on a management plan without the very persons they needed to implement it. You know, I don't know how they thought that was going to work, to present something to DWP without DWP being engaged in the process. But that's where it was. So it's kind of similar. So if that could work up in Owens, where it's beyond Ballona, it's their livelihood, you know, it's their community, really. I mean, it's our community in a way, but we have a bigger community. That's what they have, is the Owens Valley. And, you know, they don't view LADWP in the best light. So it was, I think if Leslie's asked it a question, who funded the facilitator? Let me unshare. There, here I go. Well, DWP, of course, had to fund the whole thing. That was the deal. They funded the facilitator. They paid for the agencies. They paid some of the scientists. Other scientists were working for Great Basin Air Pollution. I think they have their own money. But, you know, compared to dust control, I think it was a drop in the bucket.
So Patricia has a question here.
Patricia says, Owens is amazing looking so terrific. Ballona was supposed to be based on similar process.
Right.
It's switched to top down, but now the question is, can we get it back to the original concept? That is the question, but we will never know the answer if we don't ask that question.
Well, and that's what I'm, you know, certainly showing this and the fact that this truly does work and how amazing Owens Lake. I mean, I got to go out there since I've seen it the way it was before. Because this whole story and how you've gone about the process, I think we are, you know, you're the model for what we were supposed to have, and you showed it works. So if we can just get back there.
Yeah. I mean, it just occurred to me, when was that, a year and a half ago at the Coastal Commission meeting? I just blurted it out. I said, you know,
oh, yes,
people think that it couldn't work, but it did work in a really, you know, acrimonious place. So,
but also as you developed it and went on, your habitat sustainability or suitability modeling, as you went into area by area, is more like Joy Zedler when they found that everything went wrong in San Diego when they bulldozed, and they went to an inch by inch approach to keep, you know, everything intact as much as possible, you know, and especially from a soil standpoint, they totally screwed up the soils.
right.
But this is a terrific presentation, and I think it's very important for all those coastal commissioners and other agency entities to see this and see that it does work, and bravo.
Well, to all the people, I mean, yeah, I was a consultant, so think of all the people. Now you got to consider this. That was year after year, month after month, meetings. Wow, there were a lot of meetings. Sometimes I would drive up, you know, take in a meeting and drive back in the same day. And it was just like blurry, but it was so many meetings. So the people who aren't getting paid to do that, all of you and me now, You really have to commit, because that's one of the things that's key. That each NGO chooses the person that's going to represent. And that person has to commit to be the one to go. Because that way you have continuity.
Yeah.
And then there's built in where you can take anything that's now something to be decided by an organization, you take it back to your organization, and there's time for all that.
Mm-hmm.
And no one speaks, the facilitator never speaks to the press. You get talking points, so we're all cohesive. No wild hairs. We're working and we're all respecting, and that's the way it goes.
Margot Walter has a question.
I think Kathy had her hand up. Kathy, do you have you had a question?
Oh, thank you. Yes, Margot, like here at the Ballona Wetlands, we have these two private corporations, Playa Vista and the SoCal Gas.
Yep.
And do you think that's going to have any particular, problem compared to the
to the Rio Tinto mine and the grazers? It's a little different, but we have to try even with them.
Mm-hmm.
It would be, I think, a bit harder, but maybe you look at SoCal Gas more like DWP. I don't know.
Well,
but we have to go in, they have to, I suppose they could not join the collaborative, but
oh, they would have to.
that would be foolish.
Okay.
On
So
their
you think
part.
they should be part of it? Okay.
Yeah, I think everyone has to be a part of it to make it work, because otherwise, they could have, political connections we don't have. But if they're part of the whole thing, then everyone's neutralized in that way, I think, and we're more honest. Yeah, Walter, DWP funded it, but the facilitator, but there was a committee to interview them, made up of representatives. Not every group felt they needed to interview.
Thanks.
Margot, Jim Kennedy has a question.
Hi,
Yeah.
Margot. I wrote out my question.
I'm sorry.
I see it.
Yes, thank you.
Why was restoring Owens Lake to its historic water level not an option? Do you like to have water, Jim?
That's not the point.
That's certainly the point. It was not an option because there's not enough water. So what would have happened if a group said no to any dust control and would accept only historic, accurate, then wanted all the water back? Well, the tribes were there, and that's not exactly what they asked for. If that had happened, I mean, it's a hypothetical. There's a whole consensus approach. So we didn't need 100% for consensus, but there would be a process to work, subcommittee formed to work through the disagreements. And if that didn't work, then it could go to the governmental entities. I forget what we called that, like an executive, above the executive committee.
Okay, Margot,
But it wasn't
Leslie has a question.
an issue.
Leslie's question is, was it difficult to get people to agree and work together?
Well, it was a little sticky at first, but because the facilitator was good, she had a way of working, and And if you had a problem with how things were going, you could talk to her, it was a woman, you could talk to her confidentially, and then she took that under advisement. And but it seemed to go fairly well. There would be some hiccups where we would get a surprise from a group and have to work through it. Mainly, well, I don't know, I can't remember all of them, but yeah.
Ben, you want to ask that question?
Well, yeah, I see it. Am I unmuted now?
You're unmuted.
Oh, good. Is it possible for the meetings to be monitored properly when you're meeting remotely like we are right now today?
Okay, I thought about that. I thought about that when I was putting this together. I wouldn't recommend it. Sometimes some members had to come on remotely, but not very often. And I'll tell you, it works better to meet in person, I think.
Well, I agree, absolutely, but we're in a situation now where and by the way, I want to congratulate you on a phenomenal job. It's this, seeing what you were able to accomplish in a short period of time is like reading a science fiction book, but you actually did it. So you really have given me a boost of hope here. And,
well, it was a big team. It was a big team. You know, unlimited money. Let's you know, it wasn't like there was it was, if you're a lifelong learner and you love to learn, this was an amazing project.
Well, it's a transformational experience for the people, but as well as for a part of the planet, and a fairly large and
yes.
influential part of the planet, and you helped turn that around.
You know, it's been designated by the North American bird something as an important area. So not just Audubon, but like hemispherically it's become.
But our future right now, you know, with this group, our interest is there at Ballona Wetlands.
Yep.
And having you and your experience working with the arbitrator and somebody running the group who is disinterested, we really need that, because we need to manage for integrity, so that the group and each individual develops power to put forth positive solution. Without integrity and without transparency, that I don't see that happening. This group, though, operated primarily secretly. No press release and no contact to the outside.
No, it wasn't secret. You could talk with your group and you could issue talking points, but they didn't want people talking on their own opinion because it was the planning committee.
Right. So did you have any capacity? Did you ever do press releases from the planning committee?
Yes, I believe they did frequently.
Thank you. I don't want to take over the meeting here. I just want to compliment you. All of your presentations are so marvelous. I wish my career had been working with you rather than what I did, but so it is.
Ben, thanks. We have Jim Kennedy who has a question, and then one more after that, and then we're going to have to pull this all to a close. So Jim, go ahead.
That I really appreciate listening to the process that you went through with the different groups in their decision-making process. But if I understand your presentation correctly, they had a limited number of choices: raking, shallow flooding, managed vegetation, maybe one or two other ones. So to me, it's kind of a top-down decision-making already by limiting that, because DWP was going to have to do something within the time frame that the court order mandate told
Yes.
them they had to do. And so they brought in the community to kind of hopefully build a consensus amongst a few choices. Is that correct?
No,
Okay.
there were just those three choices: the gravel, the shallow flood, and the managed vegetation. That was coming from the Great Basin Air Pollution Control Board.
Okay.
Those were the choices that were approved, tested by Great Basin, and you can't use anything until it's tested. And you have to get a lease from state lands to even be able to test. So yes, these were the three, and DWP was very interested in, using less water because they need water. They're a water agency. That's why they took the water in the first place. So the idea was they were going to go to more water savings. And one of the main emphasis from DWP's point in this collaboration that started in 2010. So they started controlling dust in 2000 with those three. And they were already thinking about other types of modifications and testing those. So how the dust was going to be controlled was one issue, but how other interested parties were going to maintain the other values at the lake. That's what the collaboration was about. DWP, was going to, do the dust control based on what Great Basin said they could do. Great Basin makes the testing protocols. And LADWP has to go through those hoops. So it was how DWP was going to go through those hoops and maintain these other values, which are all public trust values: habitat, public access, aesthetics, cultural resources, all those things. So that was the collaboration. And what were they going to do with the water? So the big sticking point is right now the water, the groundwater. And that's what DWP is doing, a very long study on groundwater feasibility. And so that remains to be seen. But it's top down in the sense of Great Basin Air Pollution District is going to say, we don't like this method. We don't think, okay, here's what it has to do if it's going to get approved. And then state lands has to agree. So that was another aspect of this from all the agencies' points of view, from state lands and Fish and Wildlife, state Fish and Wildlife, and DWP. Every time DWP moves, they had to have another lease from state lands. And every time they had to have another permit from Department of Fish and Wildlife. That's just cumbersome on the same project, just was very cumbersome. So part of the master plan process was to streamline that process. So that's still a goal.
Yeah, thanks. Margot, let me just ask a question in terms of the participants. Did you say there was an indigenous people involved in this whole process?
Yes. There were two tribes involved, the Paiute Bishop and the Paiute Shoshone.
Okay, we've been reading this this braiding sweet grass, Robin Wall Kimmerer. And I want to read one paragraph, and it's an indigenous approach to finding somebody to coordinate, and it may be useful. We give thanks to all of the waters of the world for quenching our thirst, for providing strength and nurturing life for all beings. We know its power in many forms: waterfalls, rain, mists, and streams, rivers and oceans, snow and ice. We are grateful that the waters are still here and meeting their responsibility to the rest of creation. Can we agree that water is important to our lives and bring our minds together as one to send greetings and thanks to the water? Now our minds are one. And my feeling is the common ground, I'm almost tempted to say the indigenous, if there's some indigenous people that are involved in terms of the Ballona Wetlands, I would certainly look to them as a source of guidance in terms of how to bring some coordination. This chapter is pretty powerful from what I've read. And you went to Sacramento State to find a coordinator, and you may, I don't know, it's just a suggestion that there may be some more local indigenous guides to how to transform this over to the Ballona Wetlands. Just a suggestion.
Well, as Patricia is indicating, it's a site is a registered sacred site.
Yeah.
And John Tommy Rosa was involved in this process.
So, Margot, great job tonight. Thank you so much. Thanks for sharing your experience and all the lessons you learned with us. It really is inspiring. Your work is inspiring. What you've learned is inspiring. And I hope that we're able to implement that into the issues that we have here with the various stakeholders that are involved here. And it sounds like that you had a very similar experience. So we're looking for your guidance and taking your lead.
Well, I'll try.
Okay.